The German Shepherd had planted all four paws in the frozen gravel and would not move. Aaron Tibbs pulled the leash again, harder this time, and the dog's claws scraped 4 parallel lines into the dirt without his body shifting an inch. "Come on," Tibbs muttered. He had a clipboard under his arm and a transport van idling behind him with its rear doors already open, and 8 more stops on his route that day. The old woman standing at the gate had her cane in one hand, and her other hand pressed flat against her chest, like she was holding something in. "Please," Ruth Hartwell said. "Please, just give him one more day." Tibbs didn't look at her. He'd learned a long time ago not to look at the ones who begged. The dog's ears were locked forward, fixed on the gravel road behind him, and a low sound was building in his chest that wasn't quite a growl. Frost lay thick across the kennel roofs. Somewhere down the line, another dog started barking, and then another, until the whole row of chain-link runs was a wall of sound. Ruth's breath came out white and shaking. Tibbs checked his watch. The transport was scheduled to leave at 9. It was 8:51. Then the shepherd's head came up. Every other dog kept barking. He went silent and still, and looking at something none of them could see yet. And his tail, for the first time in 3 years, began to move. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, stay with us until the very end, because what walked through that gate next is something this entire town still talks about. We read every comment. Let's see how far this one travels. The truck pulling onto Hartwell Lane that morning belonged to Staff Sergeant Nathan Reed, United States Marine Corps, retired, and he had not been back to this road in 11 years. He was 36 years old, built broad and economical through the shoulders the way men get when their job for a decade had been carrying weight other people couldn't, and he moved with none of the urgency the morning seemed to call for. His hair was cut short and going gray early at the temples, his jaw shadowed with 2 days of stubble he hadn't gotten around to, and a thin white scar ran along his left forearm where shrapnel had opened him up outside Sanjin 9 years before. His eyes were the color of weathered cedar, brown going gold near the center, and they had a way of taking in a whole scene in one unhurried pass. The van, the clipboard, the old woman, the dog, before he decided anything at all. People who met Nathan Reed for the first time sometimes mistook his stillness for indifference. It wasn't. It was the particular calm of a man who had learned, in places he didn't talk about, that the first person to react is rarely the one who controls what happens next. He was not an angry man, though he had reasons to be one. Life and 3 deployments had simply sanded the parts of him that used to speak first down to something quieter, something that watched longer before it moved. He parked the truck at an angle that blocked the van's exit without seeming to mean to. He hadn't decided to do that. His hands had decided it for him, before his mind had finished catching up. Nathan had spent 11 years in the Marine Corps, 3 deployments. The first to Fallujah as a 19-year-old who didn't yet understand what he was signing up for. The second and third to Helmand Province, including 11 brutal months outside Sangin that he had stopped trying to explain to anyone who hadn't been there. He'd left the Corps 2 years ago on a medical discharge, his right knee rebuilt with enough hardware to set off every airport scanner in the country. And he'd spent the time since working pipeline inspection contracts that kept him moving, and didn't ask him to sit still in any one place long enough to think too hard about anything. He hadn't planned this trip as more than an errand. He had a contract starting in Cheyenne in 3 weeks. A fixed address for the first time in years, and exactly one piece of unfinished business in the town he'd grown up running from. He had come back to finally do something he'd wanted to do since he was 16 years old, and entirely unable to do it. He had come back for the dog. Ranger was an 11-year-old German Shepherd, 71 pounds of black and red sable fur gone silver and thin across the muzzle, with a notched left ear and a scar over his right eye that nobody at the shelter could fully explain, except Nathan, who could. He moved now with a slight hitch in his right hip, the cost of 11 winters on the cold gravel, but there was nothing slow about the way his body had locked itself toward the road a moment before. The clean, controlled alertness of a dog who had spent his entire life paying closer attention than anyone gave him credit for. Ruth had found him at 8 weeks old, half-starved, tied to a fence post, and left to fend for himself. And she had put him into the arms of a furious 16-year-old boy doing court-ordered community service and told him to fix what was broken in both of them. For 11 years, the dog had walked to this gate every single afternoon at 4 o'clock, the hour Nathan used to finish his shift, and sat there until the light went out of the sky. Larkspur, Wyoming sat 14 miles off the interstate, the kind of town with one stoplight and a grain elevator that had stopped operating before Nathan was born. Hartwell's Second Chance Animal Sanctuary occupied 14 acres at the edge of it, behind a hand-painted sign gone gray with weather, its chain-link runs sagging in places Ruth had patched herself with baling wire. Frost silvered the kennel roofs and the bare cottonwoods along the fence line, and the air smelled of wet hay, wood smoke, and the particular cold that announces winter is no longer a threat, but an arrival. Gravel crunched under boots. Somewhere a dog whined low in its throat. It was the kind of morning that made warmth, a porch light, a held hand, feel like the only thing worth having. Preston Hartwell was Ruth's only grandson, 39 years old, and he had been managing his grandmother's affairs for 18 months, ever since the stroke that had taken the strength from her right side and, according to the paperwork he'd had her sign in the hospital, taken her authority to manage anything else as well. He sold real estate out of an office in Cheyenne with his name in gold letters on the window. He sat on the boards of 3 small-town nonprofits and chaired the county fair committee every August, and people in 3 counties considered him a generous man who'd given up his weekends for community causes nobody else wanted to bother with. He controlled the shelter's bank accounts, the deed to its 14 acres, and the only signature that mattered on any document concerning his grandmother's care. He had already signed a purchase agreement with a storage unit developer out of Casper for $380,000, contingent on the property being vacated and cleared by the 15th of November. A volunteer who'd asked too many questions about missing donation funds the year before had been quietly let go, and nobody else at the shelter had asked since. Its old paperwork, old dogs, and a nonprofit running at a loss, Preston had told the county commissioner who approved the euthanasia order, not bothering to lower his voice in the lobby where 2 volunteers stood close enough to hear every word. "I'm doing everyone a favor nobody asked me for, and nobody's going to thank me for it either." Ruth Hartwell was 83 years old and had founded the shelter 41 years earlier with the money from selling her late husband's truck. She still rose before dawn every morning to feed 31 dogs herself, working the water buckets left-handed since the stroke had taken most of the strength from her right, and she had never once, in 8 months of recovery, allowed a volunteer to carry a bucket for her without an argument first. She knew every dog's name, history, and the particular fear or kindness that had shaped it, and she recited their stories to new volunteers the way other people recited verses they'd memorized as children. Because to her, they were exactly that important. On her key ring hung a small brass tag shaped like a paw print, the engraving worn down to almost nothing, the same tag she'd had cut the year the shelter opened. She had buried a husband and outlived 2 sisters, and never once considered closing these gates. She had not yet considered that someone else might do it for her. Nathan stepped out of the truck without hurrying. He didn't know yet that this wasn't the first time a transport van had come for Ranger, that the dog had been marked unadoptable, aggressive with handlers twice before, and saved only because Ruth had refused, in writing, to sign the surrender. He wouldn't understand the full shape of what was happening here for another hour. Right now he only understood what he could see. A clipboard, an idling van, an old woman who looked smaller than he remembered, and a dog whose head had just turned toward the sound of his boots on gravel. Ranger came off the ground like something unspooling. He didn't bark. He didn't run. He crossed the distance between the kennel gate and the truck at a flat, driving trot, hip and all. And when he reached Nathan, he pressed his whole body against the man's legs and stayed there, shaking, the way he used to shake the first winter Nathan had him, before either of them had learned that some things, once found, don't have to be lost again. "Hey," Tibbs said. "Sir, you can't park there." "I'm not moving the truck," Nathan said. His voice was even. It didn't rise. "What's the order say?" Tibbs glanced at the clipboard like it might answer for him. "County's got 9 dogs flagged unadoptable. Senior, special needs, aggressive history. This one's on it." "He's not aggressive," Ruth said, her voice thin but not shaking. "He's 11 years old and he's never bitten anyone in his life." "Ma'am, I just drive the van." Nathan crouched down, with one hand resting on Ranger's gray muzzle, and the dog leaned into it the way he had every single day for 11 years at 4 o'clock, when there had been no one there to lean into. "Who signed this order?" Nathan said. He wasn't really asking Tibbs. He was asking the air, the gate, the morning itself, in the tone of a man already deciding what he was going to do about the answer. Ruth's hand tightened on the gate latch until her knuckles went white. "Preston signed it," she said quietly. "My grandson." Nathan looked up at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the van, and at the clipboard, and at the dog who hadn't moved his head from beneath Nathan's hand since the moment he'd arrived. "Give me until tomorrow morning," Nathan said to Tibbs. "I don't have that authority, sir. Then I'll find someone who does." He didn't raise his voice once. The dog beside him hadn't either. But neither one of them moved out of that driveway, and Tibbs, after a long moment of looking at the man's eyes and deciding something quietly for himself, climbed back into the van and pulled it forward only far enough to clear the gate, and waited. Preston Hartwell arrived 40 minutes later in a clean gray sedan, dressed for an open house he'd canceled to deal with what his office manager had called a situation at the shelter. He didn't get out right away. He sat in the car a moment, the way men do when they're deciding which version of themselves to bring into a confrontation, and then he stepped out smiling. A smile built for clients and county commissioners, not for the woman who had raised him every summer of his childhood. "Grandma," he said, "you should be resting." "Doctor's orders." "You signed an order to put down a dog that's never hurt a living thing," Ruth said. "I signed paperwork that closes out a nonprofit that's been bleeding money for 6 years," Preston said. And something in his voice tightened just slightly, just enough for Nathan to notice. "I've been keeping the lights on here out of my own pocket since your stroke. You don't see that part. I see the part where you didn't tell me," Ruth said. By the time Dr. Lena Castillo's truck pulled up the lane 20 minutes later, 3 more volunteers had gathered at the fence, and Preston's smile had thinned considerably. Lena had been the shelter's volunteer veterinarian for 12 years, donating her hours every week without being asked twice, and she came carrying a folder thick with 12 years of medical records, donation logs, and 3 years of board meeting minutes that Preston had stopped attending in person and started attending only by signature. "I kept copies," Lena said simply, handing the folder to Nathan rather than Preston. "I had a feeling someday somebody would need them." Ranger had not left Ruth's side since Preston's car pulled in. He stood pressed against her legs, low and tense, a sound building in his chest that wasn't a bark and wasn't quite a growl either, and his eyes never once left Preston's hands. He had decided something about this man a long time ago, and nothing in 11 years had given him reason to reconsider it. Nathan made one phone call from the gate. His voice level. Factual, the same voice he'd once used to brief platoon commanders. He gave the dispatcher his name, his rank, the shelter's address, and the specific language of the county statute governing nonprofit asset liquidation and elder financial oversight. He did not raise his voice once. He did not need to. Preston watched him do it, and for the first time that morning, the smile didn't come back. Preston recovered his composure faster than Nathan expected. "You don't understand the legal position you're in," he said, his voice dropping into something colder and more careful. "I have power of attorney. I have a signed sale agreement with a closing date. And I have a county order, properly filed, for 9 animals this facility cannot legally keep past today." He looked at Ruth, and something in his face, for just a moment, was not performance at all. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I really am. But this happens whether you like it or not." He made a call of his own, and 20 minutes later a second van arrived, county contracted, with paperwork moving the transport up rather than back, citing non-compliance and obstruction at the original site. Ruth's hand went to her chest again. She sat down hard on the bench by the gate, the strength going out of her legs all at once, and for the first time that morning she looked every one of her 83 years. "They can't," she said, to no one, to all of them. 41 years. "They can't just." Ranger left Nathan's side and crossed to her without being called. He pressed his head into her lap and held it there, utterly still, the particular stillness of a dog who understood, in whatever language dogs understand things, that the person beside him needed something steadier than words right now. Ruth's good hand found his ear and stayed there. Nathan watched the second van turn into the lane. He didn't move toward it. He didn't raise his voice. He took out his phone instead and made one more call, quiet and unhurried, to a number he hadn't used in 2 years and had hoped he wouldn't need again. Something in his face had gone very still. Whatever came next, the gloves were now off. The second van pulled to a stop at the gate, and Ranger lifted his head from Ruth's lap. He walked to the gate slowly, the hitch in his hip more pronounced now after the morning's cold, and he lay down directly across the threshold between the kennel runs and the van. Not barking, not growling, simply lying down, his full 71 pounds spread flat across the gravel, his chin resting on his paws and his eyes fixed on the driver's door. The county handler opened his door and stopped. "He's not moving," the handler said. "No," Ruth said, her voice steadier now than it had been all morning. "He's not." Preston started toward the gate to drag the dog out of the way himself, and stopped 2 steps in, because Nathan Reed had stepped between him and the dog without seeming to hurry at all. "Move," Preston said. "No," Nathan said. It was the first time all morning his voice had carried any real weight in it, and the weight was enough. Staff Sergeant Nathan Reed, United States Marine Corps. 11 years of service. 3 deployments. Fallujah, 2 tours through Helmand Province, the second of which I'm not allowed to discuss in detail and don't particularly want to. I left the Corps with a knee held together by titanium and a Purple Heart I keep in a drawer, because I don't need to look at it to remember what it cost. He said all of it the way he'd once delivered briefings to men whose lives depended on getting the facts right. No anger, no raised voice. "That doesn't change the law," Preston said, but something in his certainty had started to slip. "No," Nathan agreed, "but this might." He held up the folder Lena had handed him an hour before. 12 years of veterinary records showing this dog has never once exhibited aggressive behavior toward a handler. 3 years of board minutes you stopped attending. And donation records that don't match the numbers you reported to the county when you filed for nonprofit dissolution. He let that sit in the cold air a moment. I made 2 calls this morning. Preston, one to a reporter at the Casper paper who's been wanting a story like this for a while. The other to the county's Adult Protective Services unit, regarding the power of attorney you used to sign your grandmother out of decisions about her own life's work. Preston's jaw worked. You can't prove any of that. I'm not asking you to believe me, Nathan said. I'm telling you what's going to happen in the next 20 minutes, so you have time to decide how you want to be standing when it does. This isn't over, Preston said, but the words came out smaller than he'd meant them to, the entitled certainty already collapsing into something closer to panic. It was over 12 minutes later when a county sheriff's deputy who'd gone to high school with Nathan pulled into the lane, followed by a woman from Adult Protective Services with a folder of her own and a face that had clearly seen this particular pattern before. Preston Hartwell stood at the gate while they spoke to him, his gray sedan parked at an angle that no longer looked deliberate. And 3 volunteers and a reporter from the Casper paper, who had arrived faster than anyone expected, watched the whole thing happen in full daylight. Nathan didn't gloat. He didn't say another word to Preston at all. He stood by the gate with one hand resting on Ranger's gray muzzle, watching a man who had believed himself untouchable get smaller and smaller in front of the same people he'd never imagined would witness it. Somebody near the fence exhaled, long and slow, the sound of a held breath finally released. Nobody spoke for a long time after that. 8 months later, the Wyoming sky over Hartwell's Second Chance Animal Sanctuary was the particular blue that only shows up in June, and the cottonwoods along the fence line were full in green where they'd been bare and silver the morning everything changed. Ruth Hartwell sat on the porch of the apartment she still lived in, a glass of iced tea sweating on the rail beside her, her right hand stronger now than the doctors had predicted, and the small brass paw print tag still on her keyring where it had always been. Ranger lay in the grass at her feet, gray muzzled and slower than he used to be, but warm in the sun, his tail thumping the ground every few minutes for no reason at all except that he was there, and it was summer. Nathan had taken him home the week after the hearing, finally, 11 years late. But Ranger split his days now between Nathan's place on the edge of town and the shelter, walking the same gravel path at 4 o'clock most afternoons, out of habit more than need. Preston Hartwell pleaded guilty that spring to financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and misappropriation of nonprofit funds. A forensic audit having traced over $90,000 in shelter donations into accounts that bore only his name. He surrendered his real estate license, paid full restitution under a court order, and resigned from every board he'd once chaired. He had not spoken to his grandmother since. The shelter's sign had been repainted that spring, the same hand painted letters, the same 41-year-old name. Nathan had joined its board the week after the hearing. He had not left Larkspur since. Sometimes a miracle doesn't arrive with thunder, or trumpets, or anything large enough to announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as a dog who refuses, for 11 years, to stop waiting at a gate, because somewhere in whatever language dogs understand loyalty in, he had decided that waiting was a kind of keeping a promise. Sometimes it arrives as a truck pulling into a driveway at exactly the right minute, driven by a man who almost didn't come back at all. Loyalty, it turns out, isn't something you measure in convenience. It's something you measure in how long you're willing to stand at a gate after everyone else has stopped believing someone is coming. God does not always send rescue the way we expect it, with thunder, with certainty, with warning. Sometimes he sends it quietly, on 4 legs, 11 years late, and exactly on time. If Ranger's story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that loyalty like this still exists in this world. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you've ever had an animal wait for you longer than anyone thought reasonable, we want to hear about it too. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if you believe in stories of service, loyalty, and the quiet courage of people who refuse to walk away, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, and remind you always that some kinds of waiting are never wasted.